Today's conversation is a special one for me. My guest is Dan Flores, historian, environmental writer, and one of the most influential thinkers on the relationship between humans and the natural world working today. His book, Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History, is not just the history of an animal, but a deep exploration of myth, ecology, violence, adaptation, and the stories Americans tell themselves about wilderness and control. Long before I ever had a microphone, Dan Flores' work shaped the ways that I thought about animals, landscapes, and power. His writing helped me understand that wildlife history isn't just about biology. It's about culture, fear, identity, and the ways humans project meaning onto the natural world. Quite honestly, his scholarship has been a major influence on my own work and my own career, pushing me to think more critically, write more carefully, and ask better questions. In Coyote America, Flores traces how the coyote became both a biological survivor and a supernatural figure, reviled, hunted, mythologized, and yet utterly unstoppable. It's a story about resilience, yes, but also about America itself. I'm honored to have Dan Flores on the show today to talk about coyotes, myth-making, extermination campaigns, indigenous knowledge, and what this animal can teach us about who we are and the world we've built. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. Dan, how the hell are you this morning? You're in Arizona, right?
Yeah, in Arizona for about 3 more months. I mean, we've got an Arizona house and we leave New Mexico, leave Santa Fe for usually January through April. But we're in Santa Fe for 8 or 9 months of the year.
Do you guys just always stay in the Southwest, or do you go elsewhere like throughout the year?
Well, we do go elsewhere. I mean, Sarah lived in Utah for a long time, and obviously I lived in Montana for, uh, 22 years, I guess. So yeah, we've spent a lot of time in other places. I mean, we've got an Alaskan Malamute puppy who's just turned 3 years old. So we haven't been traveling very much in the last 3 years until we've gotten him old enough. But we're about to resume travel here pretty soon.
Does the dog, does he handle the Southwest pretty easy with all the hair?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he doesn't handle Arizona. That's one of the reasons we leave here when we do, because it starts getting warm in southern Arizona. We're north of Phoenix a little bit, and it's warm here by the middle of April. So that's one of the reasons for migrating back to New Mexico. But Santa Fe, of course, which you know, Jason, because you've been there recently. I mean, it's at an elevation of 7,200 feet. Everybody talks about how high Denver is.
Thank you.
Santa Fe is 2,000 feet higher than Denver is. So that produces quite a bit more moderate climate.
It does, right? It's weird because, so when we drove down to Santa Fe, we were in Colorado Springs and then came down through Pueblo, where I live, and then zipped through. I wanted to show Amy the Spanish Peaks because I think they're my two favorite mountains in the entirety of Colorado.
Yeah.
And I think people sleep on the San Luis Valley, Dan. So we zipped down through there.
Through the San Luis Valley? Yeah.
I love it. And there's those horses right on the Colorado-New Mexico border.
Oh, yeah.
That are just, but you're going uphill the whole time. So by the time we got to Carson National Forest, like we're up there, and we're just keep going up.
That's right. Yeah, northern New Mexico is really high, and when I was in Montana, it always freaked me out a little bit. I lived in Missoula or outside Missoula, where the elevation was 3,200 feet, and the peaks only went up to a little more than 10,000 feet. And so I was used to sort of the Southern Rockies kind of thing where the peaks are at 14,000 feet. On the other hand, you're living at somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 at the foot of them.
Well, listen, I grew up in Murray, Kentucky and Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, and then consider Florida home. So we're not exactly mountain people where I'm from. So this was when I moved here from South Florida, like I was working for the Seminole tribe before I took this job out here, and coming out here was like all of a sudden I started thinking about skincare all of a sudden because
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm dry. I'm just downing water nonstop. I mean, this is just a thing that I learned once I got out here. There was definitely like an acclimation period. I mean, the West is different, and
Oh
it
yeah,
took
the
me a
West is
long
different.
time.
It's remarkably different and wonderfully different. I mean, I grew up in Louisiana
Hmm.
from an old Louisiana family. And I mean, I couldn't wait to get west really when I was a
Really?
kid. Yeah, as soon as I had a driver's license and my parents would let me drive a car somewhere overnight, I mean, I immediately drove 500 miles straight west. Uh, and it's I think I had been fascinated with the West because when I was a kid, when I was 4 years old, my parents had taken me on sort of a national park tour in the West,
Hmm.
and that's a really impressionable age. But it's an age where you're forming your first memories, and a lot of times you don't remember where they came from. So later through my life, I mean, when I'm a teenager, I'm having all these marvelous kinds of mental images of ice blue skies and cotton ball clouds and red cliffs, and had no idea where they came from. And finally, an aunt of mine said, "Well, I wonder if that's from when we took you out west when you were 4."
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'll bet that's what it is.
Yeah. For us, it was the exact different because we moved from Kentucky to Breaux Bridge when I was 3. And my first memories are not of Kentucky. They're of Louisiana. And I grew
Yeah.
up not as Jason Herbert, but as Jason Abair
Jason
down
Abbott.
there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Good
absolutely.
Louisiana name.
Oh, very strong. Like I grew up speaking Cajun French for the longest time. Or it's like a second language. I don't use it very often here in Colorado. Uh, but my earliest memories are not of home. Just like you're saying, it was like these start to be these glimpses. So like
Yeah.
the bayou, and
Yeah.
our neighbors had a pet alligator that we would jump in the pool with and swim around. Like this was like this. This is what we did.
Well, yeah. Louisiana makes an imprint. There's no question. I mean, my family was from Natchitoches, which
Right.
being from Beau Bridge, you know where that is. It's up in
Hmm.
the central part of the state. It was actually the first European town founded in Louisiana in 1714, 4 years earlier than New Orleans was founded. And so we were up in the sort of the piney woods hills of the central part of the state, which is a different kind of setting than South Louisiana, but nonetheless, it puts an imprint on you.
Yeah. And then there's the West, right? And I grew up. I wrote my diss on South Florida. I've got a contract that I've got to finish writing about cattle in Florida at some point in time. And now this is home, and I blame you in a lot of ways, Dan, because I read your stuff when I was writing. Sarah knows this. When I was writing my disc, I was reading your stuff a lot. I was reading you, and I was reading Jack Davis's The Gulf
Oh yeah,
a
sure.
lot.
Yeah.
And he writes beautifully, right?
Yes, he does.
But I was like, oh, the West, okay. And I had no idea I was going to get called to Colorado at some point in time. But whenever I got this offer with the Forest Service out here, I was like, all right, I guess go west, young old man. At that point in time, as I was approaching middle age. So
Go
now,
west at any time, basically.
yeah, it's. I was telling Amy the other day, I was like, we're going to redo my place. I'm not giving up on Florida. I'm not giving up my flip flops, but we're going to do a coastal Colorado vibe here. So
Well,
I'm adopting it at this point in time.
yeah, there you
So
go. That's a good
yeah,
plan. Sounds like to me.
yeah. I know people came in to listen to this podcast to talk about interior design. So that's been a really exciting thing. All right, let's ask it first. Dan, how do we pronounce this thing? You get it. You get into this in the book, but like,
Well,
how do you
yeah,
pronounce it?
yeah. So, I mean, the truth is, the name coyote comes from the Nahuatl language, which was the language of the Aztecs. And when it was rendered into Spanish, it was spelled Coyotl. But
Mhm.
the L, as I understand it in Nahuatl, is silent. And so the Aztec pronunciation would have been coyote. And I mean, that's no doubt going to thrill the hearts of all these Midwesterners and Southerners who love, and Westerners who like to shoot coyotes, who
Mhm.
love to say coyote. But That word was then rendered in Spanish as a three-syllable word, coyote. And I think it's a much, not only has better historical antecedents in terms of being the proper name for the animal, because of course the Spanish brought coyote up to the Southwest, and Anglo Americans going west, when they got to places like New Mexico and Arizona and California, that was the word they were hearing. And I think it's a better word, for example, than the basically prairie wolf term that Lewis and Clark gave to coyotes when they first encountered them. I mean, prairie wolves survived through a lot of the 19th century, but Mark Twain, when he wrote Roughing It in 1873, he basically laid out for Americans not only the proper name for the animal, but he even describes in Roughing It how you pronounce it, that it's a three-syllable coyote. And so I think that's probably the proper name. It's certainly the one that has the better historical provenance. But there are plenty of people out there who say coyote. And so the truth is, none of us is ever going to be able to convince the other group that we've got the correct pronunciation. I say coyote myself, though.
Yeah, you and I are right and everyone else is wrong, is essentially, no, it's actually a fascinating study. And we can't, to think about the regionalism of words and who uses the words and things like that. I've always said coyote, but you and I have also often heard coyote everywhere.
Oh yeah, coyote pretty endlessly. And, when I was writing Coyote America, I had a friend who said to me, well, I know you and a lot of people refer to this animal as a coyote, but anybody who shoots one calls it a coyote. And I think that that's not only sort of in a way, a political statement about how you pronounce it, but when I was doing the book, I went to some effort to try to figure out how it ended up with two different pronunciations. And I think the two-syllable one, coyote, I pretty much concluded came from the mountain men, the Midwestern and Southern mountain men who were in New Mexico in the 1820s and 1830s, because I sort of followed their pronunciation through Frederick Ruxton's books. And he never explains why these mountain men ended up calling the animal a coyote, but I think my speculation is that this little small wolf that was sneaking around their camps, they just didn't want to give it sufficient credit to give it a three-syllable name. So they called it coyote, and they took that back to the South and the Midwest especially, and it's lived on since.
You mentioned writing the book, and you and I actually started talking about having you on the pod to talk about. When I first reached out to you, I was like, well, Wild New World's just out, blah, blah, blah. I was like, let's do Coyote America. And I don't even know if at that point in time you had even started working on the 10th anniversary edition. But I think what's fascinating to me about this book, and you and I kind of talked about this yesterday when we were emailing, is that this book kind of came out of nowhere. I don't know that coyotes were on the radar before this book came out. And the first thing I think I ever read of you was bison ecology and bison diplomacy way back in the day. So I'm like, why, Dan, coyotes? Of all things, I mean, what was the generation that was like, I'm going to write this book on this particular animal?
Well, I can explain my own fascination as a consequence of growing up in Louisiana at a time and being a 12, 13, 14-year-old. In the very moment when coyotes were first beginning to colonize out of the West into the South and the East. And so as a 13-year-old, I start seeing these animals in Louisiana. And I thought that was just a stunning thing. It was like rounding a corner in New Orleans and confronting a moose walking down the street or something. This was not an animal that I would ever have associated with Louisiana, and yet here they were. So that sort of gave me a fascination with them at a very young age. And throughout my adult life, living in the West, in 3 different places in the West, there were always coyotes around. I always had them in the yard. So I was intrigued by them over many years before I actually sat down and decided I was going to write a book. And I had a very sort of concrete idea in mind about why to do that, because what I thought at the time was that coyotes now in virtually every state in the Union, they colonized their 49th state, Delaware, in 2011. Only state they're not in is Hawaii. And I thought, these animals are going to be all over parts of the United States where people know nothing whatsoever about them. And even a lot of Westerners don't seem to know very much about them. They just sort of castigate them and ignore them and push them to the margins and sometimes shoot them every time they see them. And so I thought, I think we need a book that tells the biography of this animal, particularly so that people in the East will understand something other than just the sort of street stories that they're going to hear about coyote invaders. But I will add this to this story. The reason, in fact, I began working on a book on coyotes at the moment that I did is because I had an editor at a university press, in fact, asked me to go to lunch with her in about 2005 and 6 and tell me that her press was going to start working on a series of books on animals, and she wanted a book on coyotes, and I seemed to be the person who could do it for them. And so I agreed to do that, only to several years later when I was approaching retirement and realizing, okay, I don't really want to write books for university presses anymore. I'd rather translate this coyote book into something for a New York publisher where it reaches a larger audience. I managed to wrangle with some difficulty, actually, the contract away from the university press so that I could sell it in New York or have my agent sell it in New York.
Did that become American Serengeti?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Sarah has told you this, Jason, but the way I was able to get that contract away from it, it was the University Press of Kansas that had originally had it, was I had to promise them another book.
Mm.
And so they agreed to let me have Coyote America back. I mean, I hadn't written a whole lot of it actually at the time, but my agent had actually already sold it in New York. So I had to tell Kansas, okay, how about I write you another book? And that's what became American Serengeti.
Well, there's a coyote chapter in that book too, is if I recall correctly.
Yeah, there's a coyote chapter in it because I had written for a magazine. I had written a piece on coyotes, and so what I was doing with American Serengeti is I was collecting together several pieces that I had written about various Western and Great Plains animals, and then writing 3 or 4 additional ones to sort of round out the book. And I had already published that magazine link piece on coyotes, so I folded it in. So yeah, that's where American Serengeti came from, and that's why Coyote America and American Serengeti actually appeared in print 2 months apart from one another. You don't have that happen much in your life where 2 books are out at the same time.
No, but you know what? I'll tell you that I've taught probably American Serengeti when I was teaching high school down in Florida while I was writing my dissertation. And the hard thing when you're teaching American history is where to start, right? Because you don't want to start immediately with this American colonization of the space. You want to talk about indigenous people. But then like, what is America? Where are these spaces? And I would I'd start talking to my students about steppe lions. And I'm like, look, you wouldn't make it to the mailbox, back in the day. And I'll tell you that my favorite chapter in that book is actually the pronghorn chapter.
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine, Ashley Reese, who works up in Jackson Hole now. She's telling me, she's like, I just love pronghorns. I'm like, I have a thing for you, So no, American Serengeti is fun because it's so easy to teach. You could just break this thing in little chapters and bites and stuff.
Yeah, it's episodic rather than a narrative. So each chapter sort of can be read as a standalone thing.
We were talking yesterday. I think you've sold now over a dozen copies of Coyote America. Were you surprised with the response when this book came out?
Well, frankly, yes, I was. I mean, it was a breakout book, and I would say that I had published at that point 8 books in my career, and some of them had been modestly successful. They had all been published with university presses. So this was the first book that I published with a New York publisher. And that obviously makes a lot of difference because, in New York, they know the editors at the New York Times, at the New Yorker, they know how to get things reviewed. They they know how to get you out there. My publicist for Coyote America set me up to write an op-ed for the New York Times about the book. So there are a lot of kinds of connections that a press like that has that university presses don't usually have. But I was really kind of shocked. I mean, one of the things they got very quickly was an appearance on NPR, on National Public Radio. And as soon as I did that appearance on National Public Radio, where the interviewer I was talking to actually asked me, without any advance warning, can you demonstrate for us what a coyote howl sounds like? And so I had to kind of gin up a coyote howl on the spot. The result, in any case, of that national NPR story produced about 30 regional and local NPR affiliates wanting me to go on and do a discussion of Coyote America. And so for about the first 3 or 4 months that book was out, there was a studio in Santa Fe that was doing all of these that I would drive into in order to do these interviews with these NPR affiliates. And I was going in 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, every other day it seemed like I was having to go in and do an interview. So yeah, it was kind of a stunning thing, and it was reviewed pretty much everywhere. I mean, within 2 months there were probably 30 or 35 reviews of it. So I'd never had anything like that happen with a book before, and that was it was a shocker. But I think what was going on is that the book was accessible to a lot of people. It's a fairly easily read book, and it does obviously cover a lot of ground. I mean, I mined all kinds of fields, from anthropology to folklore to ecology to literature, music, you name it, in order to put together that story. So it's a multi-dimensional story of coyotes. And it happened to come out, I think, at the very moment when coyotes were attracting an awful lot of attention, especially in places like Chicago and New York City and Atlanta. And so it was one of those happy convergences of events.
You ever get tired of talking about these books?
You know, I don't really. And strangely enough, I probably still talk about Coyote America more than I do any of the others. I would say for every interview I do with someone about American Serengeti or Wild New World, or the new podcast, The American West, that I'm doing, I probably do twice that number of Coyote America interviews, still 10 years after that book first came out.
Well, I've got good news for you, my friend, because we're going to talk about all of those. I literally, I've got like 75 books on my desk, and I'm working on a grasslands history right now for my day job. I literally have this sitting here just because I was mining through it for work the other day, alongside some. Who do I have here? I've got Omer Stewart's Forgotten Fires right next to it, and some other stuff that out here, right?
Yeah,
I'm delighted in it. All right, I want to ask you this. We've been talking about your book, and we've been talking about how to say this. Let's do something simple. Dan, what's a coyote? Like, at its most basic level, what is this animal? Because you talk in the book, there was all these people are seemingly always trying to conceptualize what this is. Is this a god? Is it a jackal? Is it a wolf? What is this thing?
Well, it's I would say, first of all, the coyote is its own animal. It is, in taxonomic terms, it is closely related to jackals, particularly the golden jackal. Coyotes and golden jackals evolved from the same taxon, the same line. And about 900,000 years ago, when coyotes were beginning to assume their present form, golden jackals and coyotes split apart in North America. Golden jackals crossed the Bering Land Bridge and ended up in Africa, the Middle East, and increasingly today in Southern and Central Europe. Golden jackals are sort of doing the same thing in Europe that coyotes have been doing here. they're spreading. But both those animals, of course, come out of the evolution of the canid family, which is a family of animals that, there's some debate today about whether the canid family is purely an American family of animals. And the sources that I follow in Coyote America, and they're still very prominent in the debate, argue that the canid family has its origins, and this includes wolves, jackals, coyotes, your dog at home. All of these animals come from an evolutionary origin about 5.3 million years ago in North America, and more than likely in the American Southwest. There is a group of people, scholars, who are arguing that the canid family may have a Eurasian origin. The debate is one between essentially folks who are relying on genetics, which is the second of those arguments, and folks who are relying primarily on the architecture of the animal's design, its morphology, the basically the paleontological sites in North America. And so you have two different bodies of evidence, essentially, that are being used to make those two arguments. But at the time I wrote Coyote America, the genetic argument really wasn't out there. And so I was following the people who were doing the paleontological and archaeological sites. And of course, there are tons of them that show the origins of the various canid animals in North America. So what we think is that the canid family produces wolves, it produces jackals, it ultimately produces coyotes. And what coyotes and jackals both represent is sort of a mid-sized version of larger wolves. In order to fill all the niches that were available, you had room for both a larger animal, the gray wolf, for example, or the ancestors of red wolves and eastern wolves, and you had room for a mid-sized predator as well. And that was the role that coyotes and jackals played. I mean, as for defining what a coyote actually is, I would say it's bigger than just that evolutionary story that sort of posits the coyote as a small wolf. This is an animal that has played such a central role, not only in the biological and ecological history of North America before humans ever got here, but particularly after we got here, that the coyote is an outsized, charismatic megafauna. It's, I would argue, the smallest of the megafauna. And I think the coyote has a bigger story to tell.
It's you say it's the smallest of the megafauna, but it also feels like, Dan, it may be the most charismatic of the megafauna as well, especially as you start to read through the book and you see the relationships. We'll talk about this in just a moment, this idea of it being this trickster animal that, I think about foxes as being sly, but realistically, this coyote, just its endurance, its ability to persist and to spread is, damn it, it's fascinating.
Well, it's fascinating. And I think what you just described is probably the reason that the coyote, from the time, very likely, that people got to North America 23,000 or so years ago, and through most of the Native American occupation and inhabitation of North America before Europeans ever arrived. It's why they select those people, at least who live in the range of coyotes, which is west of the Mississippi River. It's why they select the coyote as this avatar, this stand-in animal for humans, the stories about which come to be this central North American literature. Our oldest literature from North America are stories about coyote with a capital C.
Yeah. We'll come back to the wolf stuff in a bit, but do we want to jump into that and talk a little bit about, you talk about this in the book about us, about the coyote being us in avatar form and how we're kind of projecting ourselves onto this animal and maybe this animal back onto ourselves. Where does this, because the book's called A Supernatural and Natural History. Where does this animal fit into the cosmology of indigenous people here in North America?
Well, it's particularly for people west of the Mississippi River, and in the modern age for a lot of people, a lot of native people in the east and south as well. The coyote sort of functions as this unusually sacred creature whose story is wrapped up in kind of the origin ideas of a great many tribal groups all across Western America. I mean, virtually every group that comes from the region where coyotes were an indigenous animal ended up with coyote as this central figure in the stories they told. And I speculated because we don't really have any explanation from 10,000 years or so ago when coyote stories may have first been being told. We don't have any good information about exactly why the choice of that animal when all these other animals are available. I mean, if the selection of coyote does go back to the Pleistocene, and the coyote with a capital C is a Paleolithic god. I mean, it's farther back than agriculture in America. And if it does go back that far, it means that people consistently chose the coyote as a deity figure over saber-toothed cats and steppe lions and mammoths and short-faced bears and all kinds of other creatures that were there. And so one of the things I argued in Coyote America is that maybe an explanation is that when the Pleistocene extinctions took place and took out so many of those animals, one of the things that Native people who would have witnessed this would have noticed and no doubt been impressed by is the fact that coyotes survived that almost widespread extinction in North America. Here is this small animal that survived. And I think the coyote's impressed because they seem to have survived by living with their wits. They did it by intelligence. And I think that must have appealed to human beings who, of course, we have always, I believe, considered ourselves. I mean, we're not the bravest or the biggest. We don't have the biggest teeth, but we have managed to survive in much the way coyotes did by being smart. And I think that sort of convergence of similarities is what caused people to select coyote as this figure that they would then begin telling their stories about.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the byline here is that coyotes just survive. They just keep hanging around. In fact, they seem to be spreading or are spreading. I saw the other day that there's one in Alcatraz now. Apparently one swam across
to the island. Yeah.
So Hawaii, you're next, I guess, is really the lesson.
Yeah. Well, as I talk about in the new preface to this new edition of Coyote America, I mean, what's actually next is South America. I mean, they are proceeding at 40 miles a year through Panama and are now in the Darien Gap, that huge jungle. And the next step, of course, is Colombia on the other side. So, yeah, their next expansion. And when they successfully do that, and that's going to happen any day now, they're going to become the first mammal in 3 million years to have successfully gone from one of the American continents to the other one.
What's so fascinating to me, though, Dan, is that for the longest time, I growing up in Kentucky and Louisiana, people always talked about these animals negatively. All these hunters out there just shoot. Maybe it's just because they prey on whitetail, especially fawns, where I'm from. But it's like there's this negative perception of coyotes in the United States now amongst many people. I think you even talk about this in the book. They're ranked lower than cockroaches at some point in time.
Yeah,
also, a famous survivor.
That's right. Despite
the fact that it's everything we want to be. It's wily, it's smart, it's not the biggest, it's not the strongest. It remains. It's kind of fascinating that in contemporary society, so many people look at this animal negatively when it continues to thrive.
I've got a couple of explanations that I advance in the book for that. And I think, and I've explored some of these ideas in the other books too, particularly Wild New World, where I've done quite a bit of examination of the difference between the old world conceptions of the relationship between people and nature and those of native people in North America. But I think there are two causes for the coyote's reputation as the scoundrel vermin among so many people. And I think one is the old world adoption of herding livestock animals as part of the Neolithic Revolution, because people in the old world have been herding animals, goats, sheep, horses, cattle, and so forth, hogs, for 8,000 years. And one of the reasons I think that before that time, these wild canids were regarded much the way native people regarded them, as being admirable, as animals that you learn from, you adopted as a vision quest guide, and all sorts of things, is because it looks as if once agriculture and herding are adopted by people anywhere in the world, they very quickly decide that their enemies are the predatory animals around them. And before that happens, everybody seems to look on the wild predators as these animals that are very much like us and that we should learn from and model ourselves on. And so I think that's one thing. Old worlders bring this time-honored tradition of herding animals, and that means that you hate wild predators. And I think the other thing that happens is that the U.S. Biological Survey in the 20th century, when it was engaged in this actual war to try to wipe coyotes off the face of North America, we spent $500 million in the 20th century trying to do this. One of the things that the Biological Survey, and that's the forerunner of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, by the way, one of the things they did was to produce canned newspaper and magazine articles referring to predators like coyotes and wolves as the desperados and the gangsters of the animal world, very much like the John Dillingers, for example, of the 1930s. And the G-men are going after them just the way they're going after the Dillingers of the world. And I think that, in a way, brainwashed a whole generation, maybe a couple of generations of Americans, with the idea that these animals are vermin. And I mean, they don't know anything about them, because the truth was the Biological Survey published all this stuff before they ever had scientists investigate the role that coyotes play in the world. But I think that brainwashing contributed a lot to the sentiment that so many people just, without even trying to learn anything about the animal, they just bring to it this idea that, okay, this is an animal you're supposed to hate and try to get rid of as much as possible.
Yeah, I've often thought about this, as well as I do, how I lived in Kansas for 5 years, great city of Wichita, and then now out here in Colorado. Many of the folks who arrived out here come from German ancestry, where the wolf was the big bad wolf. I think that there are these negative stereotypes, and Europeans have their own origin stories too, and these stories they tell themselves about these animals inform their own identity. And I think in so many ways, Dan, these people come out here and they're like, this is the enemy. It's the enemy back. And these stories continue. And I want to talk about that in a second. But I do want to go back to the wolf thing. Wild New World introduced me to Rick McIntyre's books, which I devoured. I think Rise of Wolf 8 is just fascinating. Reign of Wolf 21 is just heartbreak. But there's some real interesting stories between wolves and coyotes. You talk about one occupying one space in the ecological niche and the other. These animals don't really get along, correct?
Well, it's an interesting and really kind of more complex story than
right.
They just don't get along. I mean, what the truth is here, what we think is going on with the fact that gray wolves, to be sure, the wolves that Rick McIntyre is writing about in Yellowstone, and coyotes do not get along. In fact, gray wolves will attack coyotes. I mean, one time I was touring Yellowstone with Rick, and he pointed out to me a hill that all the employees in Yellowstone referred to as Dead Puppy Hill. And I said, well, why is it called Dead Puppy Hill? He said, because every time coyotes try to raise a litter of pups there, the wolves dig those pups up and kill them. And so this has happened enough times that we just refer to that hill as Dead Puppy Hill. I mean, you can go on YouTube and you can see wolves in Yellowstone running coyotes down. They're a little bit faster than coyotes. And if they catch a coyote out in open space, they can absolutely run them down and kill them. That's why coyotes tend to try to get into the timber where they can dart through the trees and they're a little bit quicker in maneuvering and get away from wolves when they're after them. So gray wolves and coyotes do not get along. And in fact, one of the interesting things that happens in the end game of gray wolves in the 1920s, when these government and bounty efforts to wipe wolves out across the country have pretty much succeeded, is that the last few gray wolves that we know about in the West, for example, there's one in Colorado, a female called Three Toes. And the obvious thing to do when you're looking for a mate and you can't find one is to breed with coyotes. And I'll explain why that's the obvious thing in a second. But one of the things we realize is that these last wolves, including Three Toes in southeastern Colorado, did not breed. These gray wolves don't breed with coyotes. In fact, she bred with a ranch dog. And that is a common story that you find across the West in the last kind of end game in the 20s when wolves are being wiped out. Now, the reason that complicates the matter is because one of the things we know now is that as coyotes spread out of the West and out of gray wolf territory and into the South and the East, they encountered different wolves. They encountered the red wolf of the South, which exists from Texas all the way up the coast of the eastern seaboard to southern New England. And they encountered the eastern wolf from northern New England into eastern Canada. And in both instances, coyotes not only hybridized with those wolves readily, but in the case of the red wolf, coyote genes almost swamped red wolf genes to the point where red wolves were declared an endangered species largely because of hybridization with coyotes. I mean, and I tell in this new edition of Coyote America, in this new preface, the contemporary story about that, which is a really remarkable one, where coyotes in the South, having done this, have preserved more of the red wolf genome in their genetics than the red wolves that we're trying to save in North Carolina. And one of the things that's happening is that the biogeneticists are attempting to extract this saved genetic material from the coyotes that preserved it and try to help red wolves survive. But the point I wanted to make was that as coyotes encounter these eastern wolves, they hybridize with them. Well, we're trying to figure out, by the time I was writing Coyote America originally, why it's like this. Why are gray wolves and coyotes unwilling to hybridize and are sort of mortal enemies? And yet coyotes and eastern wolves and red wolves seem to readily hybridize and seem to get along quite well. And what the Fish and Wildlife Service, with a new taxonomic study of wolves and coyotes in 2012, concluded is that actually coyotes, red wolves, and eastern wolves come from the same North American taxa of animals of a wolf population that never left North America. And so they're closely related. They don't have any kind of barriers to hybridizing with one another. And what we think about the gray wolf population is that gray wolves actually had at one point left North America, evolved for a couple of million years in Eurasia, and then when they returned to North America about 30,000 years ago, they had behavioral differences that prevented them and coyotes from hybridizing. So we've got this sort of strange thing going where in the East, the wolves that we have there now are sometimes called coy wolves because they feature some degree of coyote hybridization. Meanwhile, in the West, gray wolves and coyotes don't really get along at all.
But coyotes will hybridize with domestic breeds of dogs, though, correct? I mean, I've seen coy dogs and...
Yeah, we think probably these coy wolves in the East are something like about 70% wolf, maybe 15% coyote, maybe 20%, 15 to 20%, and the remaining genetics probably come from hybridization events with domestic dogs.
I want to backtrack for a second because people who listen in are probably keying in on this idea of this lost war on the part of the United States against coyotes. You talk in the book about Lewis and Clark, this idea of the prairie wolf. Can we talk a little bit about how like European settlers are encountering this animal? Like what happens the first time that white folks are coming across the plains and encountering this animal, where they're doing so, and like what the response is? Are they conceptualizing them also as just small wolves? Like what's the European American idea of this?
Well, Europeans, I mean, are familiar with bears. They're familiar with wolves. In fact, the first environmental act old worlders put in place in America is to arrive and at once in 1630 in Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had once put a bounty on wolves with the idea. I mean, most of these Brits have not been around wolves for 2 centuries, and suddenly they're in North America and wolves are everywhere. And so their first sentiment about it is, okay, we're going to wipe them out. So as early as 1630, we get a bounty on wolves. But they're not familiar with coyotes. There is no analog of the coyote. Golden jackals had not yet moved into any part of Europe at the time that colonization was happening in North America. And so this is a brand new animal, and it's not found east of the Mississippi River. So you don't find William Bartram, for example, traveling the South in the 1770s and 1780s and writing about coyotes. He's writing about alligators, and he's writing about mountain lions, but he doesn't say a single word about coyotes, nor does any other naturalist until Lewis and Clark in the fall of 1804 get basically to the edge of the Great Plains. And at that point, as they're traveling up the Missouri River and the trees are beginning to drop away and grasslands are starting to dominate their views, they began seeing this animal that at first, in late August and September of 1804, they write in their diaries, we're seeing some new kind of fox. And then one of them, it's not clear from the journals who it is, but one of them shoots an animal. And when it's lying in the grass in front of them and they've got a good look at it, they conclude that what they've been seeing is not a fox at all. It's some new kind of wolf. And so Lewis and Clark give the coyote the name prairie wolf. So I went ahead and tried to track in Coyote America how Americans react to coyotes, since they're not really familiar with them for a lot of the 19th century. And what I kind of concluded is that all through the period after Lewis and Clark, through the 1820s, I mean, coyotes are finally officially added to Linnaean science in about 1820 or so. And it's concluded that this is an animal that stands apart from wolves. It's a distinctive creature, and it is not a jackal. It is a distinctive North American animal. But all through the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, even up to the time of the Civil War, the accounts of the travelers that I read are really kind of ambivalent about coyotes. I mean, they're fascinated with them. They talk about them. They talk about their howls in particular. They often associate them. Josiah Gregg in Commerce of the Prairies, for example, writes about the gray wolves of the West, which he says hold the scepter of dominance in the entire West. The buffalo is bigger, but the wolf is the animal that holds the scepter of dominance. But he also talks about coyotes participating with wolves, for example, in coming around their camps, and they'll throw scraps to the coyotes, which are bolder and approach more closely, and a coyote will run away from the camp only to have a gray wolf take away the morsel that they've tossed out to the coyotes. But nobody actually kind of knows exactly what to think about them until about the time that Roughing It and Mark Twain's book appears in 1873. And Mark Twain includes a passage, and of course, Mark Twain is a humorist. So he's traveling overland across the West. He's getting to see coyotes. He wants to tell Americans how we pronounce the name. The animal is called a coyote, and he does the 3-syllable pronunciation of it. But then he goes on, he starts telling a story about coyotes, where coyotes are a living allegory of want, he says. it's a slim, sorry skeleton with a wolf skin stretched over it, he says. And it's such a despicable creature that even the fleas will forsake it for a centipede if they've got an opportunity. And of course, Twain, being a humorist, I mean, he gets to going and warms up, and he goes on for 3 pages. But by the end of it, he's managed to convey an idea of coyotes as kind of a despicable, cowardly little wretch of an animal. And as I looked at the literature about coyotes after Roughing It came out, from that point on, everybody who wrote an article about coyotes in the magazines and the press of the day attempted to outdo Mark Twain in coming up with this sort of despicable characterization. And it reached a point where, of all places, in Scientific American, in 1920, a writer said in Scientific American, so here's my advice to anyone who ever sees a coyote, shoot it on sight. Because even though the animal is not worth the price of the ammunition that it's going to take to kill it, it's a patriotic act to kill it, because the coyote, after all, is the original Bolshevik. I mean, this is right after the Russian Revolution. So the coyote, this author claims, is a communist, and all good Americans are supposed to kill communists wherever we find them.
All right, this is going to get into one of the most fascinating parts of coyote miseradication, I guess. Dan, why is it so hard to kill a coyote? Because you talk about the absolute failure. They've got a very unique response system.
They really do. And so this is the part of the book that I will say, I mean, there were, of course, passages in it which were difficult to write, and I know they were difficult for people to read. I've had plenty of people tell me that. But there is a trajectory, an arc in Coyote America that is unlike almost any other book about the environment. And that's because in most books about the environment, what you're concluding is kind of this downward decline of the status of nature. And the conclusion often is, okay, we've screwed things up again. We're going to hell in a handbasket because of it. The coyote story, though, turns all of that on its head, because the coyote is the one creature, the one part of the natural world that we humans try to control. It's really sort of the Moby Dick story. It's driving Captain Ahab mad because he can't dominate the great white whale. And that's really the coyote story. It's an animal that takes everything we throw at it and nonetheless is able to occupy the very ground we're standing on, spread across North America right in the middle of our attempts to wipe it off the face of the continent. And the reason we think this is the case is because, and I would point out, and it's such a stark difference between the fate of the wolf and the coyote. I mean, by the 1920s, this campaign of bounties and government hunters attempting to poison wolves into oblivion has become so successful that the Bureau of Biological Survey has its hunters turn away from wolves. We've got this in the bag, and start focusing on what they call the arch predator of our time, the true arch predator of our time, which is the coyote. And having successfully done this with wolves, they then launched this campaign, as I said a bit ago, where this country spent 500 million taxpayer dollars from the passage of the Animal Damage Control Act in 1931 up until the time when Richard Nixon ends poisoning of coyotes on the public lands in 1972. We spend $500 million trying to wipe them out, and all we succeed in doing is spreading them across North America. The obvious question here is, why are they so different from wolves, and why does this story take this direction? Well, we don't really know that, or I would say the ecologists who are studying the animals aren't able to figure that out until the 1960s. And finally, they began to realize that coyotes, having evolved alongside gray wolves for at least 30,000 years after gray wolves came back to North America, had evolved a couple of adaptive traits to survive gray wolf harassment and persecution. And when gray wolves were gone and humans replaced gray wolves as the harassers, coyotes simply relied on these adaptations. One of them, of course, is the well-known ability of coyotes to, in times when their populations are being threatened and reduced, to actually have larger litters. They can actually vary the size of their litters based on the population of them in a particular landscape. Because, of course, what they do, they're not going to flood a landscape. Their population just rises to the carrying capacity of a landscape. And so they have this particular ability. And of course, that's augmented by the fact that when you start killing coyotes and you wipe out the alpha females that are doing the breeding, then beta females will come into heat and they will breed. And it's augmented additionally by the fact that if there are fewer coyotes in a landscape, it's easier for coyotes to raise their pups to adulthood. They have a higher survivability rate for pups. So that's one thing. But the other one that's really the kind of remarkable one and that helps produce this expansion of coyotes out of the West is what's called fission fusion. It's an unusual adaptation that only, as I understand it, 19 species around the world have evolved. We humans happen to be one of the others. This is another one of the avatar convergences between coyotes and humans. We also are a fission fusion species. And what it means is that it's possible to live as we humans normally live, living in towns and cities and in family groups as a population of a fusion population, in coyote terms as a pack or a family group. But when necessary for survival, you can break up that fusion into a fission strategy where the group breaks apart and everybody scatters through the landscape in singles and pairs. And what that often produces is colonization, at least for coyotes, and humans too, probably, into new areas as you scatter to escape the danger. And so this fission fusion adaptation, as biologists began studying it in the 1960s, they began to realize coyotes are so successful at surviving harassment, they've become so good at it, that you can take out 70% of the coyote population in a given area year after year after year without reducing the population of the animals. I mean, what you get as you take them out of a particular area is that coyotes from the surrounding region will filter in and occupy available niches and available landscapes, available territories. And that is what enables coyotes. It enabled them to do this during the Pleistocene extinctions. It enabled them to do that in the late 19th century when we Americans were wiping everything else out in America. We were taking out passenger pigeons. We were reducing buffalo from 30 million to a fewer than 1,000 animals. We were reducing pronghorns to between 5 and 7,000 when there had been 15 million of them perhaps before. But coyotes we couldn't get rid of. And the same thing has happened in our own time.
Now, I think it's fascinating that, you talk about there are coyotes in Chicago, there are coyotes in Tampa, there are coyotes in New York City. Like this is, I wonder, are these America's urban predator at this point in time?
Oh, they are. They're certainly the largest urban predator. I mean, we've got a whole complex of animals that are living in urban settings now. But one of the things that, and I say this in this preface to the new edition of the book, that it really kind of appeals to me, and maybe you have to be, a particular kind of nature lover for this to have an appeal. I can see that other people would feel threatened or alarmed by this, but to me, we cannot ever say again that North America, no city in North America has been completely civilized, that we have erased the wild, when you can look out your kitchen window on any given morning and see a small wolf trotting down the street with interstate traffic and high-rise buildings in the background. I mean, to me, the coyote has done that for us. It has meant that erasing the wild in America has become completely impossible.
I was talking to Amy the other day. She lives in Colorado Springs, and she was out for a walk, and she's like, I think I see I think I see a coyote. I was like, honey, you absolutely see a coyote. Her place kind of backs up to this big prairie out in the eastern part of the city. And I'm like, yes, I guarantee you're looking at a coyote. She's from Hawaii. She's not seen a coyote in a while. I'm like, babe, I promise you, that's what you're looking at right now. And she's got this small dog. I'm like, you want to keep an eye on Bella, right, right about now. Sarah knows this, and Dan, I'm going to embarrass you now. One of my favorite things to do now that I've been working for the Forest Service out here is driving around Colorado and seeing the spaces. And I was driving around the other day, and I was listening to your pod, and you were quite literally talking about San Luis Valley, and I was in San Luis Valley at the exact same time you were talking about it as I was listening to it. There's an analogy here, and I hope you don't take it the wrong way, between your own career. You have had this other thing going on now now you're Professor Emeritus at Montana. You've got American West. You've got this amazing relationship with Steven Rinella. When I posted that you were coming on the pod the other day, my inbox blew up environmental historians tend to get a little fanboy around you, Dan. Can you talk a little bit about what this has been like as far as I first found you through Rogan, and I always say the best thing Joe Rogan ever did was introduce me to Dan Flores. What has this been like for you? Are you finding that this whole new avenue is connecting you to new people? Where do you envision podcasts and social media and all these things going for scholars of the environment, and how we can maybe affect policy and way these animals are managed?
Well, that's
that's a lot. I'm sorry.
It's a good question though, and it's something to contemplate. I probably haven't thought very hard about it, but I will say that in the years that I was a professor and writing books for university presses and teaching graduate students, I mean, I would occasionally have a former graduate student who was a bartender, or a former graduate student who was walking down the tarmac or walking through an airport say, hey, Dan, I will admit I sometimes can travel to other parts of the country where I've never been and have the occasional bartender say to me if I belly up to a bar somewhere, so wait a minute, aren't you that guy who wrote about coyotes? Or somebody in an airport say, wait a minute, aren't you that guy? And I think part of it is something like doing a podcast or doing interviews, particularly podcast sort of interviews where people get to see you. I mean, that's sort of the first time that anyone is able to really recognize what you look like. They may recognize your name from a book or an article that you've done, but the podcast thing in particular, and probably all the interviews I've done for the books over the years, has produced at least a kind of a modest, enlarged recognition among a surprising number of people. I think what I maybe have been most surprised about is not necessarily the occasional bartender say, hey, I think I know who you are, but doing talks almost every time I do a talk. And this started, I will admit, immediately after being on Joe Rogan the first time. When I would go off to do talks, I would invariably have at the end of a talk a group of people, and they all seem to come from the same demographic. They all seem to be in their late 20s, maybe early 30s. And a surprising number of them would tell me as we began to talk, I mean, almost all of them would say, so I heard you on Joe Rogan, or I was introduced to you on Joe Rogan or something. But a surprising number of them would tell me that they were river guides, or they took people down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, or they took people into the Grand Tetons. They guided climbers into the Grand Tetons. And so I began to realize, as this happened again and again and again, that I was somehow reaching a different population of people than I had ever reached before. I mean, when you're, a university prof and you're writing books with university presses, you're basically reaching the other people who are in universities, other professors and graduate students. But I began to realize at that point that the stuff I was doing was reaching a different and certainly a larger population of kind of ordinary people out in the world. And yeah, that's been really gratifying. I'm quite excited about that.
Was You had Rinella in class back in the day? Was there any inclination that this guy was going to turn into what he did?
Yes, there was because
Really?
yeah, absolutely. When Stephen was and he was in the MFA program, Master of
Hmm.
Fine Arts program in creative writing at the University of Montana, and because of his interest, he found out about the classes I was doing in a completely different department. I was in the history department, but he found out I was doing courses and graduate classes in environmental issues, and so Stephen started taking classes with me. And the first time he wrote a paper for me, in fact, he wrote a paper that about a year and a half later ended up getting published in the New Yorker. And because he wrote about collecting fungi in particular, it was basically a paper about fungi. But he asked me to serve on his graduate committee. And when he showed me his thesis, I will never forget. After I looked through the outline of the chapters and realized that one of his chapters was called Into the Smelt Night. And it's about growing up in Michigan and going out after smelt. And I thought, wow, what a title, Into the Smelt Night. And of course, the essay held up to the title. I knew at that point, I mean, this guy has got something going on. So, meanwhile, Stephen and I had become friends, and I'd gone to parties over at his house. He had come to parties at my house, and we had become pretty good buddies while he was still in graduate school. And it was, I will admit, not surprising to me. About a year after he graduated, I was driving through Missoula, and my cell phone rang, and I was sitting at a stoplight, and I answered the phone, and it was Stephen, and he said, "I got to tell you something. I can't believe this. I just sold, I wrote a piece and I had read it that was in Outside Magazine a couple of months ago. Harvey Weinstein's book company just called and they offered me an absolutely obscene amount of money to write a book out of that essay." And I said, "Stephen, man, you are off and running." And of course, I had no idea how big off and running was going to be for him, but I knew he was going to be someone who succeeded in the world. There was no question.
No, I think one of the fascinating things about him is that his ability to really connect with people kind of across the spectrum, if you will, and talk about these environmental issues to people left, right, whomever, and relate in this really positive way. And he's not just the only guy. There are other guys. As I thought about Coyote America, I was like, Dan was doing this stuff 10 years ago, kind of telling this story of like almost like this trash animal that people had like conceptualized. I don't know if you follow Solomon David, who does a lot of amazing work with garfish. He does this gar lab at the University of Minnesota now. I just had this spectacular younger academic named Zachary Graham on talking about crawfish, an animal you and I know well. And I'm like, this is where I'm hoping that we can use through these social media, these really smart social media platforms. Rinella's got this whole other empire at this point in time. But to really reach these, that people maybe might not pick up a book or at least use this as the funnel to get to maybe the works. Are you enjoying like the American West? Because I've I sent it to every person I can think of at this point in time. Like, what is this like for you? Like going in and telling these stories now in front of a studio, and then you do the interview. Like, how does this work for you?
Well, I'm having great fun with it. And in fact, I can, say on your podcast, Jason, that they just signed me up for a second year of it. So these episodes will run through the end of this year, through the end of 2026. Um, and what they are, the people who have listened to the American West know this, but for those who haven't, so this is a podcast that's rather different from the kind of podcast most people do. It's not really having guests on like this one is with a conversation. It's a scripted podcast. It would be something like you listening to the narration, the voiceover narration of a nature program on PBS or something. And the script runs about 35 to 40 minutes of the hour of each episode. And then for about 20 minutes at the end, one of my former graduate students, a PhD student of mine, Randall Williams, and and sometimes Steven Rinella also joins us. We'll have a conversation about the topic of the script. And where those scripts come from is they're pulled from my books over the years. They're pulled from articles that I've done. They're pulled from talks I've done. So in effect, they're kind of they're readings of the work that I've assembled over the years. And as I said in the very first one of them, this was not going to be the kind of American West that a lot of people would sort of in a knee-jerk way assume it is. This is not about cowboys and Indians. It's not about trail drives. It's not about mining strikes and mining towns. It's not about any of those kinds of things. It's, for one thing, a big history story that goes back thousands and even millions of years in time in the American West and carries the story up through the present day. And it's a story that focuses really, there are kind of three topics that I've mostly written about and talked about in my career. One, obviously, is the wild creatures of North America. Another are the landscapes of Western America. There's an episode, for example, coming out shortly on the Badlands of the American West. And there's another kind of focus that has been a Native American focus that I've long done, and that's a part of this story too. So those are sort of the three strategies, the three main topics, along with the big picture, the deep time focus, and also it's not a West that ends with the so-called frontier. The West extends obviously into the modern day. So there are a lot of these episodes that are about, I mean, one of them I just did that will drop sometime this spring is about a 12-day trip that 10 of us did in two vessels, two craft down the Hula Hula River through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge about 5 years ago. And what we found floating through this crown jewel of all the wildlife refuges in the American system, and of course, a wildlife refuge that is almost endlessly under the threat of being damaged by road building and drilling. So it's that kind of podcast, something different, as I said.
No, I have. You were doing a hell of a job swaying me away from Florida, especially now. I'm thinking about 2-week-long periods of traveling and things like that. As I start to make this place my home, I'm thinking now about coyotes and their persistence here. Somebody writes Coyote America 2, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, a sequel. What's in it, Dan?
I would say they're going to be some of the same themes. I think this is an animal with a consistent historical arc through time. Survivability is without any question part of that historical trajectory. And so coyotes are going to be here. I mean, there's a famous line. In fact, I think one of the blurbers of Coyote America actually said this in a blurb on the back of the book, that when the last human's grave is covered up, a coyote will be sitting on that grave howling at the moon. So coyotes are going to be here. They're not going to be an animal that I think we have to worry about losing at any point in time, because their ability to survive clearly outpaces our ability to undermine them and destroy them. I think that they are very certainly going to be all over South America by that point, all the way down to the Tierra del Fuego. And wherever coyotes can hijack a ride to something like Alcatraz Island, in this case, they're able to swim to Alcatraz. But if they ever manage to become stowaways on ships to Hawaii or to the Caribbean, anywhere you deposit a coyote, if that coyote is a female and she's pregnant, coyotes are going to populate that part of the world because they are generalists like us. That's why we've been able to move out of Africa into the Middle East, into Europe, into Asia, into North and South America, all over the planet, to islands everywhere, and now we're considering settling in places like Mars, is we too are generalists. And I think another thing about the coyote is that it's going to continue to function as an avatar for us. And I want to call back those coyote stories that are our oldest North American literature. I mean, we've often said the coyote is a trickster figure, and most of the books about those coyote stories relate the coyote as a trickster, like, say, Loki in the Norse legends. When I was reading those coyote stories, getting ready to write that chapter in Coyote America, which I called Old Man America, about Coyote and how he came to be this semi-deity figure, I mean, I was reading scores and scores of those stories, and I knew I couldn't tell all of them. I ultimately settled on 4 of them to tell in my own voice in that chapter. But one of the things I realized in those stories is that by calling Coyote a trickster, we were kind of missing the point. And I think this is something to keep in mind as we go forward, and the coyote continues to play an avatar role. What the coyote stories have always been about is not really the trick, but why the trick works. And the reason the trick works is because of human nature. What the coyote stories are all about is illuminating for us who we are. And that's a valuable thing to know. Teddy Roosevelt had a great quote about America at the turn of the 20th century, where he said, "A great nation needs to understand itself." To me, that's a call for a critical history of a great nation so we can understand that nation. To me, the coyote stories do the same thing for us, we humans as a species. They have always been about human nature and how to avoid the common mistakes that our nature leads us into. So I think that's where the coyote story is very likely to go.
We've been talking about the past for like the last little over an hour now. Dan, what's in your future? What do you do next? Aside from this new season of the American West, lunch, I'm assuming, is coming up. But aside from that, what comes next?
Yeah, I got to go for a run here at some point. But
you guys are always talking about this cardio thing. I see Sarah running on her Instagram. I was like, I have fun with that. I'm built for power, not for speed.
Oh, so Sarah is a running beast, I can tell you.
She's amazing.
But it's sort of the fountain of youth, though. It's our particular take on it. Well, the truth is, I have sold the proposal to another book. To the next book is going to W.W. Norton, the publisher of Wild New World. And so what I'm doing with this book, I'm calling it right now, the working title of it is Homestead. But I have to sort of explain it to people in this way. It's actually a book about the reversal of homesteading. It's a book about, and I'm using the 3 places that I have done this, settled on and done this to in my adult life. One was in West Texas in the canyons of the Llano Estacado. The other was in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, and now it's in the Galisteo River country of northern New Mexico, where I've settled on a piece of ground, bought anywhere from 12 to 25 acres of ground, somewhere 15 or 20 miles outside the city. And in almost every instance, it's been a piece of ground that other people have changed, because we humans aren't able to live on the earth without altering it. And so one of the things that I've done in the beginning, almost unconsciously, and finally in a lot more conscious way, is I've attempted to restore these landscapes that I'm living on in a sort of a small scale version of rewilding, where what you do is take a human-sized piece of ground, the kind of ground that something like 400,000 of us in the American West are living on, and instead of trying to do the homestead thing where you attempt to change it so that it's going to make money for you, or it supports you by running cattle or chickens or horses or whatever, you try to take it backwards and restore it to the condition it was in when native people had it, and it was a far wilder landscape. So this particular book is about reverse homesteading in a way. And as I said, I'm using these 3 places where I've done this myself as kind of the forward trajectory of it.
I'm sure it will be book number 76 here on my desk at some point, Dan. Dan, I got one last question for you. You know that this podcast started off initially as a film podcast. Some crazy person came on and did A Million Ways to Die in the West. I can't remember her name. When are you coming on talking about a movie?
Well, one of the fun things that's going to happen this year, I think it's going to be in the late summer, is that famous New Yorker article, Coyote v. Acme, is going to come out as a film. And what that story in the New Yorker was about was Coyote hiring a lawyer and bringing a product liability lawsuit against the Acme company for all this bad shit that they sold him over the years, none of which worked. And so that's coming out as a movie sometime this summer. And I think if you have me on sometime, Jason, and we do a movie, that's the one I want to do.
Only if you can find one other guest star for that pod.
I'll bet I can.
Maybe you can round her up. So, Dan, I've been looking forward to this for the longest time. My listeners have been looking forward to it. I can't tell you how much I can thank you for being on here today. I saw Cody in the background there. I can only assume as well. This was a blast. Thank you so very much for coming on. This was awesome.
Oh, it's been great fun, man. Thanks for having me.
Man, that was fun. Thank you so very much to Dan Flores for coming on today and talking to us about his new book, Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History, the 10th anniversary edition of this book. Dan's written a bunch of other stuff. Some of my other favorites are American Serengeti, The Last Big Animals on the Great Plains, or actually my single favorite book of all time, which is called Wild New World, the epic story of animals and people in America. You can actually go buy all of them if you want. So thank you so much. And thank you, of course, to another amazing scholar of the American West and the environment herself, Sarah Dant, for introducing Dan and me and helping make this podcast episode possible. Sarah, you are a favorite around here and just awesome. Another awesome person to thank is Fletcher Powell. He's our producer for making this show run. Thank you, Fletcher, for being here. You make this show happen. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for coming in and being part of this podcast. Thank you for sharing this. If you see this on social media, please go ahead and share it, retweet it, repost it, whatever it is that you do. Thank you so much. And make sure you subscribe to this pod. We've got a whole bunch of stuff coming for you real soon. So thank you so much for being here, and we will catch you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.